Excellent. Just to follow on from Guna's comments, one of the things that inspired me when we were in Sydney last year was one of the guys who did the devotions last year was an Anglican who was being supported from New York in a church plant into Australia by a Presbyterian church. I thought that was so cool. Wouldn't it be really good if we really did confuse the heck out of everybody working like that? You know, and so the challenge to really collaborate differently and also to be kingdom-centered, but also what can happen when we actually do come together like this. So it's just great seeing the vibe in the room. We all seem to be getting on quite well, considering we're from kind of real diversity of backgrounds. So great to see the conversations happening. So Andrew, we'll turn over to you, and it's just just one other comment. Obviously, Guna has brought up the whole city-to-city thing. If you have any thoughts about this and, you know, future stuff, if you could talk to me, I'm hoping we'll be having a conversation. So, so if you've got any thoughts that feed into ongoing stuff, it would help me to know if you're interested in any way, okay? So just opening the door for that, okay?
Thanks, Nigel. And just to reiterate that, keen to keep talking about what might follow from this, and very open to whatever form that might take. Just a couple of things to emphasise in what Guna brought to us this morning. City very definitively positions itself as not a denomination, and therefore seeks to be whatever use it can be or resource it can be to networks and denominations in a way that has a straightforward posture of servanthood, of usefulness, or not. Do you know what I mean? That is, there's no. So another way to put that is to say there's no such thing as a city-to-city church. There are city-to-city assisted, city-to-city trained church planters, city-to-city pastors, city-to-city trained pastors, city-to-city funded Presbyterian churches or Anglican churches or independent churches or Baptist churches or Churches of Christ or Brethren churches or congregational churches, whatever that may be. There's no such thing as a city-to-city church. Because we love the planters who connect with city-to-city, we sometimes talk like they're ours, right? But that's just love. That isn't real ownership. So the second thing, we did some research in Australia on the fruitfulness of church planting. And so I just thought I'd share this research with you through a thing called the National Church Life Survey. Have you heard of the NCLS? So the NCLS in Australia found that church plants reach what NCLS calls newcomers. So in NCLS world, there are two kinds of newcomers. There are unchurched people and there are de-churched people. And the definition of a newcomer is someone who's not been to church anywhere in the last 5 years. Okay, so if you've been in church in the last 2 years, you're still regarded as a churchgoer. That might say something about what we expect. But anyway, let's not go there. If you haven't been around for 5 years, then you're really not a churchgoer. And so the research was what percentage of attenders on NCLS Day in church plants were newcomers, that is, had been in this church but hadn't been in the church, any other church, for 5 years, and what percentage were not newcomers. And the answer was in Bible-based churches, evangelical churches, that were established churches, 8% of people were newcomers. And what that does, it raises an interesting question, which is, what would your ideal percentage of newcomers be? So you might say, 90? I know an organisation that had an incredibly fruitful mission. This was on a university campus where in June there were 50 members of the group, and in August there were 100 members of the group because 50 people had come to Christ. So they had 50% newcomers. And by November the group had ceased to exist because it was just burnt out. They didn't have the capacity to take on 50% newcomers to 100, from going from 50 to 100, and it killed them. It was kind of one of the most sad things I've ever seen, actually, in ministry. So I think 90% newcomers in a church, that's probably going to kill everyone. That's going to kill the newcomers. There's enough people to disciple them, to grow them, and leaders and all that. So it's interesting to reflect on what do you think the ideal percentage of newcomers in a church might be. In church plants, the NCLS found that the percentage of newcomers was 17% on average. So 8% in established churches and 17% in church plants, which actually just is a kind of a research-based confirmation of the fact that in at least the Australian context, church plants, for all the reasons they're going to outline, just tend to be more fruitful, hungrier, more focused, especially on evangelism, for all sorts of really great kingdom-minded reasons and for all sorts of pretty understandable but maybe not quite so noble, just survival reasons, right? There's more newcomers in church plants than there are in established churches. And which is part of what fuels us to say it is a great investment to be investing in church planting. To also say there's a whole range of different kinds of church planting. There's the absolutely cut snake Apostle Paul evangelize a church into existence from the word go by one person, right? So I have a friend of mine wanted to move into a suburb where there are a real lack of churches, and he was just going to move into there and just walk up and down the streets, meet people, join groups, join clubs, find people, evangelize them, lead them to Christ, start a church, a small group, and then turn that into a church. That is pioneering church planting at its most awesomely gifted, because that's what you need to be to pull that off. Okay. At the other end of the spectrum is the pure mother-daughter congregation plant, which is within the safety and security of all the infrastructure that goes with a big church. That's got resources and building and capacity and staff and budget. What they do is they begin a new work in place, on site, in the building, just at another time on a Sunday. Now, is one better than the other? Actually, I'm not sure one's better than the other. There are all sorts of good reasons for one to do one or the other, and there's a whole range of things in the middle as well. Mother-daughter plants that are on different sites, so that you're moving, not mother-daughter plants at all, but raise up a launch team, sometimes called a core group. I prefer launch than core, but so a launch team from a range of different churches, so not just one church. That runs all sorts of interesting relationship risks, as you'd know. We had a church start directly over the street from us. So we're on this side of the road. It was literally a 90-degree, straight across the street start. Big church, Anglican church one side, charismatic church on the other side. The truth is, I rejoiced at that plant. Because, well, I'll say a little more about that, why in a moment. So there are all sorts of different kinds of church planting. One of the things that City City's finding, particularly in Australia, is the opportunity to do revitalisation of churches through congregation planting. So it's churches that exist currently, a bit like the story I told of my own church context yesterday, which is with a fairly dysfunctional and broken church that had got lost in the 1950s. The way that the revitalisation of that came about was through congregation planting. And so what's interesting about that is that it draws on all the strength and resources, particularly in the capacity that existing churches have, and at the same time brings to bear all the opportunity and especially missional fruitfulness that church planting can bring to bear. And so we've consistently had between 15 and 20% of our established church. We were founded in 1840, and yet we've consistently had a 15 to 20% newcomer ratio because some of the dynamics of church planting can be brought into the established church context. So that's another model. Yeah.
Congregation planting, can you just explain briefly?
All I mean by congregation planting is that, so it's quite a common pattern in the Sydney context especially, but Australia in general, that a single site will have multiple services during the course of the day. The Lord I think it's in the book of Hezekiah, chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, says they should be at 8 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, and 6 o'clock at night. So 8, 10, and 6. And so we have services that are at 8, 10, and 6. And each of those congregations functions fairly independently in its own life and has a fairly full expression of its own Christian community life. So they'll run small groups within that congregation. They'll meet. They'll have outreach events that are associated with that congregation. They'll have a weekend away for that congregation. One of the challenges then is managing the whole versus the parts issue, which is just a challenge. That's okay. But the idea of congregation planting is to say there's a slot, what I think of as a vacant service slot on a Sunday. Almost always Sunday. I mean, I know there are plants that can meet on Saturdays, Saturday nights. The Roman Catholic Church, interestingly, in Australia, has got a massive movement of congregations that meet on Saturday night, 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock on Saturday night. So it can be a Saturday, but mostly it's a Sunday, and say there's a vacant congregational slot. Let's plant a congregation in that congregational slot.
Just sort of multi-service, but not quite.
Yeah, no, multi-service, just straight down multi-service, but all part of the one church, one leadership, one governance, one eldership, one budget, one team, one vision, one mission, one values. The benefit, particularly in an Australian context, is that although it's not designed like this, that tends to work out that anyone under 30 goes to church in the evening, often because they have part-time jobs on Sunday mornings or socialise. Anyone over 30 goes to church in the morning, and that's because if you're over 30 and have kids particularly, then you don't want to take your kids during what's in my context known as the arsenic hour, the witching hour, the kill your children hour, which is the sort of 5 to 6 or 7 o'clock time. You don't want to take them to church at that time. That's no good for them, no good for the kids. It's no good for you as parents. You don't hang around after the service. You just scoot as quickly as you can because they need bathing and feeding. So kids stuff happens in the morning. And once the dynamic between a morning congregation with kids ministry and an evening congregation with youth and young adults, where the youth and young adults learn ministry because they get to do it in the morning and serve the morning congregation. Parents don't have to leave church in order to be looking after the kids. The parents can send their teenage, slightly rebellious kids to the evening service so that they don't have to rebel against God, they just rebel against their parents. They can go to church another time. And this sort of dynamic that runs between the morning and evening service has really emerged as a pattern in, as I say, particularly Sydney. Often evening services on a Sunday are the biggest services. They grow quickest. They have the most easy sort of access into for mission into non-believing contexts and communities. And that's proved quite fruitful. And so our missional strategy, I thought it was a brilliant insight from Guna to say the way in Singapore to get to parents is through their kids, because what Singaporeans are doing is pouring themselves into their kids because they work so hard they feel guilty that they're not looking after their kids enough. So that's I don't know if you picked that up just as a really insightful piece of cultural analysis informing ministry. And it prompted me to think about the equivalent in a Sydney context. But this dynamic of morning and evening works quite well in Sydney. So our current mission strategy is we've got 3 sites in our amalgamated parish. We've planted 10 at site number 1, and then 6, and then 10 at site number 2, and then 6. And later this year, God willing, we'll plant 10 at site number 3, and a couple of years down the track, 6, and then we'll have 10 and 6 at all 3 sites, and that this engine will just start really moving, growing, and then in due course, we'll start 10 somewhere else, and 6, and we'll just keep pumping this thing. Any questions about that, just by way of catch-up?
Just want to get clarity around the statistic and what that might mean for the area. I'm thinking, so 15 to 20% new presumably means 80 to 85% of the new churches aren't coming from other churches around the area.
Either around the area or from the mother church, if it's a mother-daughter plant.
Right, yeah. And the clear advantage is that they're evangelizing just at twice the rate of the existing churches.
Correct.
So I'm wondering what research has been done on the overall effect of, say, 10 churches in the area.
There's some kind of so this is a little bit brutal, which is to say I think there are, the question of transfer is an interesting question in church life. I think there's legitimate transfer. We think of legitimate transfer. Sydney is a very mobile sort of city. Where we are in particular is quite near the University of Sydney. And so people move from out of area into our area because it's sort of on the edge of what's expensive, and you can get reasonably cheap student digs there. And so it's a classic moment for dropping out of church life and the Christian life when you move area. And so for us, a key kind of mission strategy is to kind of prevent de-churching. Because then if they're out of church for 5 years, then they become newcomers that you've got to go find later on down the track, you see. So when people move into our area, we feel like if we can get them before they drop out of church, and it's so interesting to talk to people. Often people come to church and will say, I've been looking at the church, I'm new to the area, it was time to find a church. And I'll say, how long ago did you move in? 6 or 8 months. And it's like 6 or 8 months pass before they even get their sort of feet on the ground, having moved into a new place. And if you're out of church if you're out of the church-going habit, just the rhythm in life for, a year? It's hard to get back into it. You just I think that's legitimate transfer. I've got no time for anyone who says that's not real ministry there. Illegitimate transfer is what's called sheep stealing. Sheep stealing's terrible. No one should do it. Of course, none of us ever do it. Sheep stealing's bad. Mostly said with conviction. And it's also true. And I'm a little bit. My wife's a small business person. I come from a small business background, and I'm just saying that competition is good. And there's a reason why there were people right around the church where I am during the 70s and 80s and 90s, and who didn't even cross the road to go to that church because it just wasn't that good a church. And if what church planting does is to help churches go, you know what, we need to shake our head and wake up and shake the dust off and say, come on, we've got to get going. We've got to be a little more flexible. We can't just do things, or we've got to think some more. We've got to skill some more. We need to invest in professional development, and we need to empower more leadership, and we need to take more risks. And if what church planting does is, in a sense, lift the bar, and I'm going to mix my metaphors here to say, and that raises the level of water, then a rising tide lifts all boats. A rising tide lifts all boats. And if what's happening in an area, in a city or a region, is that there's a rising tide of both spiritual temperature through church planting and also just plain innovative competence of church life, then that will lift all boats. And if there are boats that just say, no, we're going to stick with our 1975 model because it's what then, and if they sink, I think I'm happy to say that not about them, to them. Well, you so be it. You sink. And that's how it is. And the only thing worse than them sinking is if there's nothing that would else cause the tide to rise. And so I think I'm just pretty happy to be a little bit brutal there. So church planting, which God will use with all sorts of really great kingdom-oriented motives and all sorts of maybe not quite so great survival, desperation, competition motives, and all of that stuff that's all in our hearts all the time to really cause the tide to rise. And so like I say, I can genuinely tell you, when the church opened right across the road from us, I rejoiced because I thought, this is good. This is going to keep us on our game. Now, they're a different church from us, and I'm going to say a bit about why different churches matter and are important. So, in a sense, I don't see them. I don't even see them as a threat. They're not supposed to be a threat. Who's the enemy? Right? I mean, actually, who is the enemy? It's the evil one. That's the enemy, not each other. So, I rejoice for church plants across the road from me. I rejoice. It's not like there's a lack of non-Christians in the inner West. For crying out loud.
One of my pastors said when a new church opened up in our city, he said, how can we complain when the Lord has sent more labourers for the harvest?
Right, yeah, you've been praying it. You pray for the Lord to send labourers to the harvest. How are you complaining for the... Lord, we didn't mean those labourers, we meant our labourers. I want to finish off a little bit from yesterday talking about evangelism in a post-Christian environment, and in particular, just this question at point 3 here on equipping contextualised Christians. And just make a couple of quick comments to finish off that session, and one of which is to say this. There's a very significant dynamic and feedback loop that happens between Christians' growth and Christians' evangelising. Okay, it's a beautiful upward spiral of a virtuous cycle. It's evangelising Christians grow and growing Christians evangelise. And those two things work together upwards and they work together downwards as well. Okay? What that means is that a core part of your discipleship in church is to equip people for evangelism. And this is one of the ways in which discipleship and evangelism actually don't compete for resources and focus in church life, but are mutually reinforcing. This tension that we can sometimes feel, are we going to be outward focused or are we going to be inward focused? Are we going to look to reach out to the city or are we going to look to reach to build up people? Are we going to care for those outside the church or are we going to make sure we care for the people inside the church? And the answer is they don't have to compete with one another, because evangelizing Christians grow and growing Christians evangelize. What that does is it makes me want to ask you the question, and this is just a kind of today's sort of reflection day, right? Today's practical hit the ground reflection day, takeaway challenges. And so here's one of the challenges I want to leave you with today, which is this. What is your personal evangelism training system in the church where you're serving? Because here's most personal evangelism training systems in most churches. It's once every 3 weeks, pastor yells at congregation from sermon to go and evangelize more. And that's it. So you've got these 3 basic topics that pastors touch on in application. One is to have your quiet times more. Second one is to give more money. And the third one is to evangelize more. Okay, so and I joke about that, but I know someone who listened to 100 random sermons from Sydney evangelical preachers, and 85% of the sermon applications were have your quiet times, give more money, and evangelize. 85%! As if that's what the Bible, it's so. Talk about eisegesis right there. So what I'm challenging you here a little bit is with, do you do better in equipping believers in personal evangelism than just yelling at them every now and again to go and evangelize their friends? Do you have a system, a training program, a way that will ensure that people who come into the church who are newly saved, that's what we're all in, how are they going to learn to evangelize people? Now, it's true that they're often highly motivated and highly networked, but they're also highly ignorant. And so there's a whole education process that goes on there, but also not just education in Christian content, but how to evangelize, how to share the gospel, how to share Christ with people. And so what's your program, your system perhaps, for ensuring that people are equipped to do what is a really pretty difficult thing? Because if all you needed to do was just take 1 Corinthians 6 and quote it, then any idiot could do it. But that's not what we can do. We've got to do all of that work that we looked at yesterday of contextualization. So just a couple of thoughts here. I think it's really important in content and conduct that we equip believers. In content, it's to teach the issue of worldviews through narratives. So it's stories. This is the reason why we like movies, but now we like TV series more than movies. Why is it that we've shifted from... what's that Deadpool thing? No. What's the new Marvel movie? I've not even seen one of them. I just can't quite get there because I don't know. cartoons. Um, we've shifted, though, from movies to TV series. And it's an interesting thing in the age of Netflix, why we've done that. I take it's because TV series gives the opportunity for a greater development both of plot line and of character. But it's all about the telling of stories. And all stories have a similar form. There's a beginning situation, there's a problem, there's a solution, and there's how it ends up. Every romantic comedy, every rom-com has he and she are happy, frolicking around in their lives, doing their thing. They meet each other and it's all going to be beautiful. That's stage one. Then there's stage two. She likes someone else. Or they have a misunderstanding. There's a problem. Then there's stage three. Some helpers come in and they fix things up. And then there's stage four. They're sleepless in Seattle and they get together and Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks live happily ever after. Okay, so that's a story. If there's no problem, there's no story. So the gospel is a story. Creation for redemption, including renewal and consummation. Okay, the gospel is a story. Every TV series is a story. Every movie is a story. There are variations on these themes. Every worldview is a story that answers these questions. Every person is living according to a story. And one way to talk about what we talked about yesterday, which is in terms of entering the narrative of our culture, is to understand the story that we're a part of and know how to ask questions about it in a way that opens up its cracks. Because the secular story is the best story going for most Westerners. It's better than every other story that they've heard or understood. It's constantly, ceaselessly reinforced in every movie, in every shopping centre that they go to, in every ad that they see, constantly reinforcing that story. And just underneath the surface are some pretty horrible cracks. But we've got to slice open the story a little bit to get to the cracks. And we need to equip people to know how to engage with unbelieving friends and family members about the story. I'm going to an election party on Saturday night. So I get back on Saturday, I'll vote. And then I've got some great friends who are highly networked with their neighbourhood, and they invited their friends around for this election party and their pastor. I'm going to meet all their non-Christian friends, and I'm beginning to. They'll all be highly left-leaning. The Labor will get in. They'll rejoice, and which is fine. And I'm preparing myself for the party to think, what are the questions that I can ask that will just maybe plant a little seed of doubt about the narrative that they've got about how great it is that we're just continuing down this process of progress as the Labor Party once again restores Australia to its, the glory of Bob Hawke, who died actually. Bob Hawke, fascinating Prime Minister, died yesterday. I've got to get in and ask questions about the story. So here's another way to say this. Is there a context, a regular context, by which all members of the church can be equipped to know how to ask questions that expose the cracks in the story of New Zealand culture? Does that happen? Are you doing anything about that? Are you teaching people to do this? Or is all we say about evangelism, just do it? Right? Nike Christianity doesn't work. And Nike training doesn't work. You can't just say to people, just do it. Crucial and alongside the content is the conduct, and especially the posture of humble boldness. And it's a gospel that, as it permeates the person's own heart and soul, that will give them this posture of humble confidence. It's a gospel that tells you and this is a Kellerism, right? So if you listen to any Tim Keller, you'll know that he says this on a kind of regular basis, that you're more loved than you ever dared hope. That you're more loved than you ever dared hope, and therefore you can be confident. You have a boldness, a confidence in God's love that makes you non-defensive. And at the same time, you're more sinful than you ever dared face. You're more broken and needy and wicked and dark than you ever dared face. That's what the cross tells you, isn't it? That's what the gospel tells you. That at the same time and from the same thing, that you're both more sinful than you ever dared face and more loved than you ever dared hope. And the fact that you're more loved than you ever dared hope makes you confident and bold at the same time as the fact that you're more sinful than you ever dared face makes you humble and therefore non-aggressive. How can you attack other people as being terrible people when you needed Jesus to die for you? I mean, it's a bit ludicrous, isn't it, really? You can't, whatever posture you have towards other people, as only as it ever comes from someone who's been forgiven 70 times, 7 times by God, who's been forgiven 10,000 talents. Right? What's the point of that parable? Do you know how much 10,000 talents was at the time? The sum total of all money in circulation in the entire world. 10,000 talents was the equivalent of several $100 trillion. That Jesus picks the example to make it ludicrous. That someone who's just been forgiven 10,000 talents won't forgive someone else 300 denarii is the most stupid thing on the planet. Which is what it's like when forgiven sinners get cranky at other sinners. It's like, really? Have you forgotten? Is it not the gospel of God's grace and forgiveness that you're standing in and seeking to commend to someone else? So sure, it is true that unrepentant sinners will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That is true, the kingdom of God. They won't. Jesus was as crystal clear on that as can possibly be. But whatever stance you take, whatever posture you have about that can't be anything other than humble confidence or confident humility. But it can't be one without the other. It can't be one without the other. So, and then as I mentioned yesterday, this practice of questioning evangelism, teaching the asking of questions. The Christian thing is so on the nose in the West at the moment that the standard posture of unbelievers to Christians, even friends, the ability for people to be have love and respect for an individual, but still hate the Christianity that individual embodies, is just one of those lovely kind of weirdnesses that we see around the place. And so it's just crucial that we teach people to ask questions. We're so anxious about this question of evangelism that when the opportunity arises, we kind of the heckles go up. It's like a cat under threat. The fur goes up. You feel it on the back of your neck, and it's boom, out you go. And it's critical to actually equip Christians, train church members to stay calm, to just be calm, to just be confident and humble and ask a question. And it won't take very long before what the impact of asking questions will be is that the person will ask you a question back. But at this time, not an attack question, a real question. So all in all, I'm saying it'd be a great conversation if you're part of a team here today or a church community to say, actually, yeah, how is it that we do equip Christians to do personal evangelism now? Because you can't rely on IFES or Student Life or Campus Crusade to do it at university. It's a good thing, but you can't outsource this. You can't outsource it because you've got hopefully 15 to 20% of newcomers in church who never went to IFES or Campus Crusade or whatever at university, even if they went to university. So you can't rely on it. So where is it in church life that people are equipped for evangelism? Because they have to be equipped, and just telling them to suck it up and try harder and just do it ain't going to work. Alongside the focused training moments, obviously will need to be prayer. Obviously will need to be modelled. I find this a constantly challenging thought that the evangelistic temperature of a church is almost never greater than the evangelistic temperature of the leaders or pastors. As a pastor, it's just unbelievably easy to get caught up in managing church life and not being missionally engaged, and forgetting. But it's very rarely the case that a Christian community has an evangelistic temperature that's greater than the evangelistic temperature of its leadership. That's very rare. And this kind of thing needs to be mapped out and demonstrated in preaching. This approach of contextualization, of understanding people at depth, of knowing that it's up to us, it's our task, it's our calling to be intelligible, to be culturally intelligible, not just linguistically intelligible that we speak the same language, we're culturally intelligible that we speak the same cultural language. And churches are great at creating alternative countercultures, and that's important. And at the same time, it's risky. It's risky because a person can inhabit entirely their church culture and forget how to live and operate in the culture out there. So this is challenge number one for me from today, is where is this equipping of believers happening in your context? Where's it happening? What are you doing explicitly to make this happen? I want to go and talk about integrative ministry. This is a vision for church life that attempts to create a balance, although balance is not quite the right word. Balance sounds like there are opposites or alternatives that need to be sort of middled out and blanded together, right? Not blended together, blanded together, by which I mean everything gets a little bit so that nothing is properly satisfied or done, right? Now that's not the idea here. Integrative ministry is a recognition that actually many parts of church life will feed on and be mutually reinforcing of each other. So I tried to do just a little bit of integrative thinking when I said it's evangelizing Christians who are growing. There's nothing like being out there and being challenged about your faith and trying to explain the gospel to people to help you grow. It's one of the most growing things you can do as a Christian is to evangelize. And at the same time, it's growing Christians who do the evangelism because they're the ones that understand more deeply, who get in their hearts, who feel, experience in their hearts, who mourn and grieve in their hearts. So evangelism, personal evangelism, and personal spiritual growth and maturity are not actually, in the end, alternatives to each other. They belong together. They don't have to be one focus or the other focus. Actually, they grow together. They're synergistic. And integrative ministry is a way of trying to reflect that. And particularly, I want to start by bringing to you a key text, which is Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. So Colossians 1, Colossians in general, is a letter that presents a vision of Christ as Lord of all. And 1:15 to 20 might be a song or a hymn, an early church song that they would sing. If that's the case, that's fine. It just means that Paul adopts the hymn and says, this is a pretty great hymn, I'm going to use it in Scripture. Or he might have made it up himself. Or he might be a hymn writer as well. Who can tell? But listen to this vision of Christ and what it does to integrate all of life into the Christian life. So here's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn, speaking of Christ, the firstborn of all creation. Firstborn, just by the way, there doesn't mean firstborn in the Jehovah's Witness sense, that he's the first part of created things. It means firstborn as in the one who inherits. I am all for, actually, this ancient practice that eldest children inherit significantly more than everyone else. And coincidentally, I should just let you know that I'm the eldest child in my family. Surprise, surprise. The firstborn was the inheritor. Okay? And so when Paul writes that Christ is the firstborn of all creation, what it means is that he's the inheritor of all creation, not the first bit of creation. So Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Image meaning visible bit, visible thing, visible moment of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him, in Christ that is, all things in heaven and on earth were created. Things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the head of the church, of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. So this is a massively important paragraph in the New Testament. It is incredibly challenging, and part of what I want to do right now is to sort of ensure that you grasp just the full difficulty of this passage. Okay, so I want to problematize it for you and make sure you get just what a really confronting thing it is that's said here, and then allow that to percolate a little bit, because then that will inform the rest of where we're headed, and we'll finish up around 5 to 1 for this session. So notice the universality of the victory of God in Christ here, and especially notice the scope of Christ's headship. So Christ's headship is expressed here in terms of seniority, that Christ is before all things. It's expressed in terms of origin. All things were created through him. Christ's headship is expressed in terms of purpose. All things were created for him. It's expressed in terms of continuance. That is, the only way all things hold together is in him. It's expressed in terms of Christ's own being, because it's all the fullness of God. I think that there's maybe the 8th or 9th use of the word all, by the way. In little words repeated tend to pass us by in the Greek. The allness is just so ubiquitous through the passage. It's like this drum beat that you just can't miss. It's the actual beat that this passage moves to. All the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in Christ. And notice that the headship of Christ is expressed in terms of reconciliation, that God was pleased to reconcile all things to Christ, to himself through Christ. So the centrality, the seniority, the origin, the purpose, the continuance, the very being of Christ and the work of Christ are put forward here in astonishing universality. All things, all things, all things, all things, all things, and all things. Now, just think about the scope of this all things. Paul is very clear to say that it's all things in heaven and on earth. There are two places, there's heaven and there's earth, and so that's really covers the field. And not only that, just in case you weren't persuaded by that, there's two kinds of things. There's visible and invisible. And so it's all things, remember, back up to here, Christ was before all things in heaven and earth, and all things visible and invisible, and all things are created through him. That's all things in heaven and earth, and all things that are visible and invisible, and all things were created for him, all things in heaven and on earth, and all things that are visible and invisible. All of it created through him, for him, hold together in him, and have been reconciled to God through him. And notice that the apostle goes on and is so bold to say even that this all things includes not just things in heaven and earth, not just things that are visible and invisible, but includes all thrones and dominions and rulers and all powers. So you'll know that in the New Testament, thrones, dominions, rulers, and powers are on the whole bad things, right? So notice what it just said is that all things, not just the good things, all things were created through Jesus Christ, for Jesus Christ, hold together in Jesus Christ, have been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. Not the good things, all things. So you see how I just made things a little bit more complicated just there? Yeah, if your little theological, machine is whirring here and this can't be, what is he saying? That's good, keep whirring. I want you to whir. Think about all things. What's included in all things? Country music.
And Manchester United.
Well, maybe not country music, actually. You too? Yes. Yeah. So music. So that's an easy one to go for, actually, is that music was created. Jesus was before music because, music was created through him and music's created for him. and music is upheld by him, and music has been redeemed and reconciled to God through him.
Even country music.
Even death metal. So that's music. What are some other things? What are other all things? Give me another example. That's a really great example. The arts. So if you're a musician, I'll come back to Islam in a moment. That's a very interesting thing to say, and coming back to it gives me time to think. If you're a musician, any musicians in the room, like professional musicians? If you're a musician, this text says something incredibly important to you as a musician about your music, which is that music belongs to Jesus. And that does not mean hymns, turn all music into hymns, right? That's not what it means. It means all music of every kind, of every sort, all belongs to Jesus. So think about what that means for musicians, and pastors out there, think about what it means for discipleship of musicians. So Islam, what is Islam a type of? It's a type of religion. It's a type of worship, isn't it? It's a dominion, actually. What does it mean for Paul to write here that all things have been created in and through and for Jesus Christ and reconciled to God through Jesus Christ, including the worship that is embedded in the human heart? Now, I want you to feel the force of the problem. I'm going to give you an answer in a moment, which is going to be an unsatisfying answer until you go and read the book that I tell you to read. But I think this is the book that I'm going to suggest that you get is, I think it provides a way forward in understanding this, because it takes this text seriously. So come back from religion. What are other kinds of areas of things? Great. Yes. Amen. And so God is greater than evil, and God puts an end to evil. And that's why this your theological engine is whirring, and that's why this text is a problem. Because it seems to say that God created all things, including the thrones and dominions and powers and authorities, and the one thing God can't do is evil. Not in a way that makes him responsible for it. Because if God does evil, you can't trust or love him. Right? That's about as clear a thing in the Bible as there can be. If God does evil, you can't trust or love him, and so God cannot be a doer of evil. Otherwise, he's Satan. So this is the yin and the yang, the circle, which has the white thing on the top and the black thing on the bottom, the white and black dot. This is called monism, and the view that reality, or God in one sense, is got both black and white in it. That's fundamentally an alternative worldview to Christianity. For God cannot do evil. He cannot do evil.
But what about free will? I think like Paul, like so for example, England knew that if created Paul like Jesus a big song, but if what we do with their gift,
Indeed, and so your theological engine's whirring away, and one of the ways that we handle this issue is by the question of free will. And yet, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, Jane, has pointed out that our free will doesn't exist or operate outside of the sovereignty of God. And so that's just another way of coming at this question from an individual, personal point of view. I want to keep just going down the track a little bit of what are other all things. Sex, human relationships. Sorry? Politics. Humans living in a society with one another. Addiction. So human dysfunctionality or grasping of some kind of which is often a need for transcendence in some form or other, or escape that takes over a person's life? What about education systems or food production systems? What about healthcare, health, legal systems, business, manufacturing, knives, by which I mean, of course, scalpels to heal people with, or to stab people with in the form of swords. You see what I'm trying to open your mind to the all things, and as you grapple with, you're supposed to, what you go, that thing too? Economic systems, systems of production, systems of distribution, transport systems. Are these things that have been created in Jesus Christ, for Jesus Christ, have been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ? So, any truckies here? You know, of course, that your life is more dependent upon truck drivers than probably any other kind of person on the planet. Everything you have, well, at least everything I have, it might be a little bit different here. Everything in Sydney comes on a truck. If the trucks stop driving, then everyone in Sydney dies in 3 days. It's just that simple. There is no other person as important. Even the plumbers are not as important as the truck drivers. So transportation logistics, the truck mechanics, transportation logistics are the single greatest contribution to human welfare now in cities, because you don't grow things in cities. So what does that do for you if you're a truckie and you read this and you get it, that it's talking about all things have been created in Jesus Christ, for Jesus Christ, are sustained by Jesus Christ, have been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ? What does that do for you as a truck? What business are you in as a truck driver? You're in the Lord's business. That's what you are. Do you see how this text changes everything, actually? My wife's a veterinarian. She would be a terrible minister. And a worse preacher, actually. She would hate it, and people would hate her doing it, actually. And she'd be the first to say these things. She is a fantastic vet and an emerging, even better, small business person who's moving into manufacturing as a what they call a side hustle. It has been perfectly clear all through our lives that what she does is no less God-honouring, God-oriented, or in the orbit of what Jesus Christ is doing in the world than what I do. Because the only thing worse than her being a minister would be me being a vet. I hate that stuff. Blood and poo and guts and pus. It's just terrible. What a thing. Is there any vets in the room? See, good. Stay out of it. And yet what this text says is that the animal husbandry industry, the interface between human beings and animals as we have dominion, which means both tend as well as and cultivate, so including eat, that's all part of the thing that Jesus is doing. Now, the reason I emphasize this is because it's a vision of Jesus' lordship like this that gives us the path for what it is to be disciples of his in a broken world. And to put it in technical language, what this does is overcome dualism. So the great gift of Greek philosophy, gift I say in inverted commas, of Greek philosophy was to bequeath to the Western world the idea that souls and soulish stuff, prayers and thoughts and ideas and meditation and spiritual things were good and pure and real, and that messy, crappy bodies that get smelly and are diseased and break down and get decrepit and bleed and all of that kind of stuff, that they're bad. Soul's good, body and flesh and stuff bad. And what's more, there's an enormous amount of sense to that. If you've known someone who suffers incredible physical hardship with incredible nobility of spirit, you'll know, right? You'll know that there's something in this. Greek philosophy didn't run the world, the Western world, at least for the last 2,000 years, 2,500 years, for no reason. It's not like they're idiots and that people are idiots for believing it. If you've known someone to suffer profound physical degradation, one of the kind of congenital diseases that from time to time afflicts people, but to do that with immense nobility of spirit, you see them broken and feeble before you on the one hand, and on the other hand, you see them towering in their spirit. You know that in a sense, you reach for. They're not their body. They're so much more. They're their soul. Now you take that and pump it through a kind of a quasi-Christian theology, and you end up with spiritual stuff is good, prayers and ministry and priests, good, and physical stuff, veterinarians and plumbers and truck drivers, mostly useless, if not bad. And that's called dualism. And it is deeply infected in Christian culture throughout the Western world. There are other cultures that have other problems. Our problem is dualism. And I think it's particularly Colossians chapter 1 that gives us the resources to overcome dualism, and instead of separating things off into higher and lower categories like that, and good and bad, to bring them together in a way that binds them in an integrated unity. The challenge in this text is, how is it possible to understand that all things are reconciled to God when so many things are still very wicked? And it's a book by a guy called Al Walters called Creation Regained that says the reason that we struggle with this is because we approach this question as though it were a one-dimensional question. Just, are things good or are they bad? Is democracy good or bad? Is forest harvesting good or bad? And what Walters says is that instead of thinking in one dimension, we need to think in two dimensions, what he calls structure and direction. Structure is what he suggests has been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. So that everything in its structure has the capacity to be that which serves Christ. The question is, which direction does it face? In my accounting, in my plumbing, in my school teaching, is the direction of the work that I'm doing, and the industry that this is a part of, is that facing Christ, or is it facing away from Christ? And the challenge that Walters puts is to say that everything in principle, because it's been reconciled to God in Christ, in its structure, everything can face Christ. Everything can face Christ. And therefore nothing is to be rejected in and of itself. Now, did I say that that would be an inadequate answer until you went and read the book? I did say that. And so if that answer feels a little bit inadequate, then that's because I said it would, and you've got to go read the book. But I think that's the only way forward I've found to know how to actually handle the full implications of the text. One way to handle the text is to not actually embrace its full implications. Is to stop short on the all things and just to go, all things means most good things. But that's not what the text says. The text, and it's not like the text is kind of accidental about the all things. The text is just like a flippin' sledgehammer on all things, isn't it? Paul is really trying to get this all things thing across. What that ends up meaning for life and ministry is that or the way City has kind of codified this, is to say we want to see and have a vision of churches operating in 4 what we call ministry fronts, as an attempt to bring together an integrative vision of what ministry involves. That includes the core functions of the church of evangelism and discipleship, relating people to God and relating people to each other. I've made some comments about how evangelism and discipleship are mutually dependent. That's why this is a vision of integrative ministry. They're mutually dependent because you need to have evangelism to have anyone to disciple, and you need to have discipleship to have anyone to evangelize. So evangelism and discipleship need not be alternatives that compete for scarce resources in the life of the church. They can be an integrative set of ministries that connect to one another in a mutually dependent way. And likewise, the crucial role of community is clear in evangelism and discipleship. Both the community gathered in worship and the community gathered in fellowship. Because worship can be directed to both believers and non-believers. It's very interesting. One of the, I think, questions which Willow Creek sought to answer. Willow Creek, you know, the very large church in Chicago. One of the questions that Willow Creek sought to answer was, can you build up Christians and evangelize non-Christians at the same time? And their answer was no. Their answer was no. And so you know what they did? They had 2 services. They had a Sunday service, which was a seeker service, and they had, I think it was Wednesday night service, which was a believer's service. And so you get your seekers on Sunday, because that's when they knew to go to church, because they're still in a sort of Christendom-type situation in the 1980s in Chicago. And so everyone knows to go to church on Sunday, and so you get seekers to come to church on Sunday, and if there are believers who need to bring them and meet them at the church, who are their friends or family members, then that's when they might go to church also. But that service was not a church service to build up believers. I don't know if you've ever seen a Willow Creek church service. It was incredibly interesting and creative and kind of vibrant, and always had little drama skits that were just right the rage in the 1990s, and very little singing. The teaching was always topical. It was always self-help. It always had a kind of a problem in life which was solved by Christ, and it was not at all designed to build up Christians, because that was Wednesday night, when they had an bog standard, dull, start with a worship song, have some announcements, have the 2 sacraments, announcements and offertory, and they're the 2 sacraments, right? Announcements and offertory, and it was just a very standard church service to build up believers. Their answer was, no, you can't build up believers and evangelize unbelievers at the same time. I want to suggest that that's the wrong answer. That answer is incorrect. And I'm going to suggest to you why it's the wrong answer. It's the wrong answer because the issue for both believers and non-believers is the heart. The issue for both non-believers and believers is the heart. What is sin? Sin is, according to St. Augustine, actually according to the New Testament, actually according to the Old Testament and the New Testament, what is sin? Sin is a disordered heart. A heart which is disordered so that rather than loving small things a small amount, and medium things a medium amount, and big things a big amount, and God the most of all, that's what a rightly ordered heart does, right? Because we're supposed to love multiple things. You're supposed to love your spouse if you have one. You're supposed to love your kids if you've got them. You're supposed to love your neighbour. We've all got those. You're supposed to love your enemies, actually. You're supposed to love lots and lots and lots of things. And the question that Augustine, I think, is the first to really bring to sharpness, clarity, is to say, are the loves of your heart, the desires of your heart, rightly ordered? So that the smallest love of your heart are really small things like the approval of other people. That's a small thing, right? The approval of other people. So that's why you love it only a small amount, isn't it? It does almost nothing for you when people are really, really just thinking you're a great person. And equally, it does almost nothing for you when people think you're a total creep. That's water off your duck's back, isn't it? You don't mind that. That's easy because you don't love it very much. We love small things way too much. big things, loving your enemy, that's a really big thing. Jesus is pretty clear about that. If you want to be perfect, the word doesn't mean sinless, the word means complete. Be fully rounded like God is rounded. Any idiot can love their friends, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7. Any fool can love their friends. Matthew 6. Any fool can love their friends. Even the thieves and rogues, and they love their friends. If you want to be like God, if you want to have the family pattern stamped on your life, guess who you love? You love your enemies, just like God does, who makes the rain to fall on the righteous and the wicked, and he makes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. That's what God does. So you want the family likeness, then love your enemies. So that's a really big thing. And so how much do we love our enemies? Imagine if not even non-Christian enemies, if Christians just love their Christian enemies a lot like that. That'll change a thing or two, don't you reckon? So that's what it is to have to live like God wants you to live. That's what it is to be a Christian, is to have a reordered heart so that it loves God the most and at least is on the journey towards loving little things a little amount and medium things a medium amount and big things a big amount. It's the same issue for non-Christians. Non-Christians and Christians have the same sin. Every sin we do comes from a wrongly ordered love. That you don't love something as much as you should, or you love something more than you should. And so you can minister to and preach to Christians and non-Christians at the same time with the same words, preaching the same gospel of grace, because it's only grace that is love for the unlovely. It's only grace that will actually reorder the desires of your heart as you find something even more beautiful than hating on someone who's your enemy. Because hating on someone who's your enemy feels pretty good, actually, doesn't it, at times? Don't you find that? You get to slag off at them, and you rejoice when they come down, and you just really enjoy finding out that they haven't done as well as they thought, and then you can contribute to that. Hating on people who are your enemies actually feels pretty good. That's why you do it. You do it because you love it. And the only thing that will change that is finding something to love more, which is to find out that God loved you as an enemy. He loved you so much that he gave his son for you. And when you get that that's what you are, a loved enemy, then you will start to love your enemies. You see what I just tried to do to you? I tried to do a bit of gospel renewal to you, which is to take an issue and express the cross of Christ, the grace of God in the cross of Christ, in a way that matches or corresponds to that issue, so that it flips you, so that you let go of that other love and you start loving Jesus more. So you can preach to Christians and non-Christians at the same time, and Paul expects that this is going to be the case. You see it there in 1 Corinthians 14, 24 to 25. If all prophesy, an unbeliever or outsider who enters is reproved by all and called to account by all, and after the secrets of the unbeliever's heart are disclosed, that person will bow down before God and worship him, declaring God is really among you. As their hearts are exposed, they worship God because they're in the gathering of believers. I think 1 Corinthians 14 is a very important text here to say that it's not just possible, but it's expected that the connecting of God of people to God, whether believers or unbelievers, can happen at the same time in the same place. So that's when we're gathered in worship, but also when we're gathered in fellowship, we can have a fellowship that's also directed both to believers and non-believers. It simply takes a village to raise a child, as we know, and I suggest that it takes a church to raise a Christian. There is no vision of discipleship apart from community in the New Testament. And so the crucial importance of community in growing Christians, or living out what the New Testament calls the one another life. You just can't avoid it. I think it's 62 times the New Testament talks about the Christian life in terms of one another. So on the one hand, the issue of community is crucial for Christian growth, but it's also crucial for evangelism because of the phenomenon of belonging before believing. It's being part of a Christian community almost always now precedes believing in Jesus Christ. It's not the case. I still know some people who independently read a Bible and believe. Right? That can still happen. There's no doubt about that. But most people have their plausibility structure, that is what they think of as inherently and obviously making sense or not making sense. That gets changed when they're part of a Christian community that functions well in grace, and they just are forced to go, this is not like I thought it was. This is messing with my categories. This is making more sense than I wish it would. How can these people be like this when they're supposed to be the haters in our community and actually they're the lovers? So you see the point I'm trying to make here. I'm suggesting that evangelism and discipleship actually don't belong apart from each other. They belong together. They belong both as we're gathered in worship and they belong as we're gathered in fellowship. And an integrative ministry is to embrace both the call to evangelism and the call to discipleship in a way that doesn't put them in different departments within the life of the church that compete for scarce resources, but that understands that the task of mission and evangelism and the task of discipleship and spiritual growth are profoundly interrelated with one another. They're to be integrated with each other. And that means that you can do both at the same time, in the same moments, with the same groups, in a way that preserves both as core points of focus for church life. I think we'll stop there, and I just want to point out that means that I'm 10 seconds early for lunch, and we'll stop there. We'll come back and talk afterwards about some other what I'm going to call integrative functions of church and what holds it all together, and then we're going to talk a little bit about movement as we finish up the session later this afternoon.